June 22, 1941. Dawn broke over the forests and rivers of Eastern Europe, and with it came the sound of thunder. Not the sky's thunder, but the rolling, mechanical storm of 3 million soldiers moving east. Operation Barbarossa had begun. The Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border in an unbroken line of steel, fire, and dust, the largest invasion in human history. Behind the panzers came infantry, artillery, trucks loaded with fuel, and mobile crematorium for what they called the final solution. The invasion stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, 1,000 miles of destruction. German commanders were confident. They believed the Red Army would collapse in weeks, that Moscow would fall by autumn, that the Soviet Union would be erased from the map. But the people who lived on that land, the farmers, the workers, the children, woke to a nightmare. Villages disappeared in smoke. Cities like Minsk and Smolensk were surrounded within days. Millions of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner. The front broke open like a wound, and through it poured the machinery of extermination. Yet even in those first weeks, amid the shock and confusion, seeds of defiance were already taking root. In the far north, along the Gulf of Finland, lay a city that the Germans had planned to erase completely. Leningrad, the birthplace of the revolution, home to artists, writers, and workers, stood between Hitler and the Baltic. He ordered that the city not be taken, but starved. "Cut it off," he said, "bomb it to dust, and let hunger finish the rest." The siege began in September 1941. Railways were cut, supply lines severed. Food stocks ran out within weeks. By winter, the city's 3 million inhabitants were trapped, surrounded by German forces on land and Finnish troops in the north. The winter came early, the cold like a living thing that crept into every room, every lung. People boiled leather belts for food. They burned books, furniture, anything that could keep them warm. Bread rations dropped to 125 grams a day. The city became a frozen tomb. But it did not surrender. Musicians still played. Teachers still taught. The Leningrad Radio Orchestra performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in the middle of the siege. Its notes carried through the frozen air as a weapon of spirit. The audience wept. In that music was defiance, proof that even as bodies fell, the soul of the city would not. Thousands of miles away, on an island that stood alone in the Western Sea, another people had already faced the storm. A year earlier, in the summer of 1940, Britain had been on the brink. France had fallen. Europe was Nazi territory from the Arctic to the Pyrenees. The British Army had barely escaped from Dunkirk, leaving behind all its weapons, its tanks, its vehicles. Hitler expected Britain to negotiate. Instead, Churchill stood before Parliament and said, "We shall fight on the beaches." He meant it. The Luftwaffe came, day after day, night after night, raining fire on London, Coventry, Liverpool. But above those burning cities, young men took to the skies in Spitfires and Hurricanes to stop them. Outnumbered, outgunned, exhausted, the pilots of the Royal Air Force fought until the invasion plan was abandoned. The Battle of Britain was won not with numbers, but with will. When it ended, Britain still stood, battered but unbroken. Across occupied Europe, people listened to the BBC and heard that voice, steady, fierce, unyielding. It told them that the fight was not over, that surrender was not the only choice. The power of that message reached places the British could never see. In the forests of Poland, in the streets of Paris, in the cellars of Prague, people tuned radios in secret, risking arrest, even death. The Germans ordered all radios confiscated, but many were hidden under floorboards, behind walls, in attics. Each broadcast from London was a spark. The BBC spoke in French, Polish, Czech, Russian, its words carrying across borders like whispers of hope. "This is London," the announcer said, and for those living under occupation, those words were like oxygen. It wasn't just news. It was proof that somewhere, someone was still fighting. In the darkest years, when resistance seemed suicidal, that voice from London told Europe that defiance still mattered. By 1942, the Red Army had stopped the German advance outside Moscow. The invincible Wehrmacht had met its first real wall. The winter that froze Leningrad froze them too. Soviet soldiers fought in snow up to their knees, using rifles older than themselves, often without proper boots or coats. Yet they fought. In villages burned to the ground, peasants joined partisan groups, ambushing German convoys, cutting supply lines, hiding down pilots. The forests became alive with resistance. Each act of sabotage, each bullet fired from the trees, was a message to the occupiers. You can burn our homes, but not our will. Stalin called it the Great Patriotic War, and for millions of Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, it truly was. Every day of survival was an act of rebellion. Every step forward on frozen ground was vengeance for the dead. While Leningrad starved and the Soviet Union bled, far to the west, the people of Poland faced their own torment. The Germans had made Warsaw a city of ghosts. The Jewish population was forced into a ghetto, surrounded by walls and barbed wire. Disease and starvation did the killing long before the bullets came. By 1943, when the Germans came to liquidate the ghetto, the people inside chose to fight. With homemade weapons and smuggled guns, they rose against their captors. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising lasted less than a month, and the fighters were annihilated. But they had shown the world that even condemned men and women could resist. The fire they lit would burn again, brighter, the next year. In August 1944, when the Red Army was at the edge of the Vistula River, the Home Army of Poland launched the Warsaw Uprising. It was one of the most tragic acts of defiance in history. Tens of thousands of civilians joined the fight. Children carried messages through sewers. Priests blessed rifles in ruined churches. For 63 days, they fought block by block, house by house, against German tanks, artillery, flamethrowers. The Soviets, waiting just across the river, did not move. Stalin had his own plans for Poland, and the city was left to die alone. When it ended, 200,000 people were dead. Warsaw was flattened. But the memory of that fight, of ordinary people choosing freedom over submission, would outlive the rubble. Defiance took many forms. In France, resistance networks like the Marquis and the Musée de l'Homme groups printed newspapers, sabotaged trains, and smuggled information to London. In Yugoslavia, partisans led by Tito fought a brutal guerrilla war in the mountains, tying down German divisions that could have fought elsewhere. In Denmark, fishermen smuggled thousands of Jews to safety in Sweden under the noses of the occupiers. In Greece, villagers ambushed convoys and paid with their lives. The war was not just soldiers and generals, it was bakers, students, teachers, housewives, all finding ways to say no. And inside Germany itself, where dissent was a death sentence, resistance flickered. The White Rose, a group of students in Munich, distributed leaflets calling for an end to the war, for Germans to remember their humanity. They were caught, executed by guillotine, their words scattered by the wind. Among the officers of the army, some had come to see what Hitler's rule truly was, a nightmare dragging their country into ruin. One of them was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. In July 1944, he carried a bomb in a briefcase into Hitler's headquarters. He believed that by killing the dictator, Germany could save itself and Europe. The bomb exploded. 4 men died. But not Hitler. The attempt failed, and the conspirators were executed, their families destroyed. Yet even in failure, their act was a final echo of the same truth that had sustained Leningrad, Warsaw, and London, that no tyranny lasts forever, and even surrounded by fear, men can choose courage. As 1944 turned to 1945, the tide was irreversible. The Red Army advanced westward through Poland and East Prussia, leaving cities in flames. The Western Allies crossed the Rhine. Berlin was encircled. The Nazi Empire, once stretching from the Atlantic to the Caucasus, was collapsing in on itself. But the cost was almost beyond comprehension. Tens of millions were dead. Entire nations scarred. When Soviet troops entered what remained of Leningrad, they found people so thin they could barely stand, yet still alive. The siege had lasted 872 days. Over 1 million civilians had perished, but the city had never fallen. It had endured hunger, bombardment, disease, and cold, and it had survived. In the West, France was rising from its ashes. The years of humiliation and silence were ending. In June 1944, when the beaches of Normandy erupted under the thunder of Allied landings, the whole of Europe held its breath. The invasion that Hitler had feared for years had come at last. Paratroopers fell from the night sky. Ships stretched across the horizon. Villages shook with artillery. Yet behind enemy lines, another army was already in motion, the underground. The French resistance, once scattered and hunted, rose in a single wave. In towns and cities, in the mountains and fields, they struck railways, ambushed German patrols, and guided Allied soldiers through the maze of occupied territory. When Paris finally rose in August, the fighting was fierce and desperate. German tanks roamed the boulevards, but so did men and women who had waited 4 long years for this moment. Street by street, they fought, until at last the tricolour flew once more over the City of Light. Charles de Gaulle marched through the cheering crowds, not as a conqueror, but as the voice of a nation reborn. France, battered and broken, had stood up again. And the message was clear: no matter how deep the shadow, the dawn always comes. When Berlin fell in May 1945, the world exhaled for the first time in 6 years. The thunder that had begun in Poland ended in the ruins of the Reichstag. Soviet flags rose above a city of ghosts. The streets were rubble, the air thick with dust and the stench of death. Civilians wandered like shadows among their own destroyed homes, unsure whether to feel relief or despair. The Allies met on the Elbe River, Russians and Americans shaking hands, their uniforms caked in mud, their faces hollow from exhaustion. Across Europe, the guns went silent. It was over. Yet in the silence, there was no joy, only the weight of what had been lost. 27 million dead in the Soviet Union, 6 million murdered in the Holocaust, cities wiped from existence. But even in that devastation, something indestructible remained. From London to Leningrad, from Warsaw to Paris, humanity had proven itself capable of unthinkable endurance. The war had shown how far cruelty could go, but it had also revealed the strength of compassion, of courage, of refusal. And as the soldiers returned home, they carried not only scars, but stories of resistance, of ordinary people who refused to surrender even when surrounded by death. In the years that followed, Europe was a continent of ruins, but also of rebuilding. Every brick laid, every window replaced, every bridge repaired was an act of quiet defiance against the memory of destruction. In Warsaw, where 85% of the city had been turned to dust, survivors rebuilt the old town by hand, using old photographs and memories. In Leningrad, the people who had eaten bark and boiled leather during the siege returned to their factories and schools, determined to live again. In France, the names of resistance fighters were carved into the walls of every village, and in Britain, bombed-out cities became the foundation of a new world. The grief was endless, but so was the will to heal. Monuments rose for the fallen, but the real memorials lived in the people who refused to be defined by tragedy. They had looked into the abyss and climbed back out. They had proven that freedom, once fought for, can never be truly destroyed. It only hides, waiting to be claimed again. Time moved forward, but the memories never truly faded. In Leningrad, grandmothers still lined up on January mornings to honor those who starved beside them, placing flowers in the snow. In London, the generation that had watched the Blitz still glanced upward at the sound of aircraft, a reflex etched into their bones. In Warsaw, every cobblestone of the rebuilt old city carried the ghosts of those who had fought and fallen in its streets. In Berlin, where the war had begun and ended, the children of the new Germany grew up surrounded by silence, by questions their parents rarely answered, by guilt heavy as stone. Yet even there, the story of resistance survived, the memory of men like Stauffenberg and the White Rose, who had risked everything to restore honor to a country led astray. Each generation carried forward a different lesson from the same war, that courage is not inherited, it is chosen. And in every corner of Europe, those who remembered carried within them both grief and gratitude, grief for what was lost, and gratitude that the world, somehow, had endured. When we speak of those years now, it is easy to think in dates and battles, Normandy, Stalingrad, Berlin, but history is not made by numbers. It is made by hearts that refused to stop beating, by hands that kept working when all seemed hopeless, by voices that whispered freedom even when whispering could mean death. The Second World War was the story of destruction, yes, but it was also the story of defiance. It was the story of the fire that would not die. From the skies of Britain to the frozen lakes of Leningrad, from the burning ghettos of Warsaw to the silent conspiracies in German offices, it was the same human truth repeated again and again, that tyranny can burn cities, but it cannot extinguish the will of the human spirit. The men and women of that generation left behind more than ruins and graves. They left behind proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, light still flickers. And that light, once kindled, will never truly go out. It burns still, in every act of courage, every choice to stand, every refusal to surrender. It is the flame of remembrance, and the promise that we will never let it fade.